I'm reviewing Philip Johnson's Darwin on Trial from 1991. In my book, Mind and Evolution, as assessed through reviews of major texts, I divide reviews into sections. In terms of those sections, I'd rank Johnson as an outsider. Partly that's because of his profession as a lawyer, not a scientist, and partly because of his creationist connections. He was one of the co-founders of the intelligent design movement and of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. But despite this, in Darwin on Trial, his argument is remarkably rational. Like the German scholars in the 19th century bringing scathing textual criticism to bear on the Bible, he brings a lawyer's analytical tools to bear on what modern evolutionary theory actually says. Here from Wikipedia, some background. As a lawyer, quote, Johnson was an active professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and held visiting professorships at Emory University and at University College London, my old college. Clearly a highly qualified lawyer. As a Christian, quote, in 1978, at the age of 38, Johnson became a born-again Christian following a divorce, and later became an elder in the Presbyterian Church, USA. His inspiration, quote, Johnson recounted that while on a sabbatical in England, he sought through prayer inspiration for what he should do with the rest of his life, and then received an epiphany after he read Richard Dawkins' The Blind Watchmaker and Michael Denton's Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. Johnson later said, something about the Darwinists' rhetorical style made me think they had something to hide. Despite having no formal background in biology, he felt that he could add insight into the premises and arguments. Johnson stated that he approached the creation-evolution dispute not as a scientist, but as an academic lawyer by profession, with a specialty in analyzing the logic of arguments and identifying the assumptions that lie behind those arguments. End of quote from Wikipedia. It's easy to dismiss Johnson because of his creationism, but I think that would be a mistake. We have here a highly trained lawyer arguing the case against the modern synthesis, the reigning account of evolution. I think evolutionists should welcome such a critique. Two quotations outlining his approach. I assume that the creation scientists are biased by their pre-commitment to biblical fundamentalism, and I will have very little to say about their position. The question I want to investigate is whether Darwinism is based upon a fair assessment of the scientific evidence, or whether it is another kind of fundamentalism. And again, quote, my purpose is to explain what concepts the contemporary theory employs, what significant statements about the natural world it makes, and what points of legitimate controversy there may be. I am interested in what unbiased scientific investigation has to tell us about the history of life, and in particular how the enormously complex organs of plants and animals came into existence. End of quote. Johnson's text resists illustration through steps in argument taken out of context, so I will instead list his chapters, accompanying them by a mere scrap or two of text taken from each chapter. Note how methodically he carves his argument against modern evolutionary theory into chapters. Chapter 1, the legal setting. of his analysis of the trials he covers, he says, "My purpose is to examine the scientific evidence on its own terms, being careful to distinguish the evidence itself from any religious or philosophical bias that might distort our interpretation of that judgment." Chapter 2, Natural Selection. The question is not whether natural selection occurs, of course it does, and it has an effect in maintaining the genetic fitness of a population. But Darwinism asserts a great deal more than merely that species avoid genetic deterioration due to natural attrition among the genetically unfit. Darwinists claim that this same force of attrition has a building effect so powerful that it can produce such wonders as trees, flowers, ants, birds, and humans. How do we know all this is possible? Chapter 3, Mutations, Great and Small. Whether one finds the gradualist scenarios for the development of complex systems plausible involves an element of subjective judgment. It is a matter of objective fact, however, that these scenarios are speculation. Bird and bat wings appear in the fossil record already developed, and no one has ever confirmed by experiment that the gradual evolution of wings and eyes is possible. Chapter 4, The Fossil Problem. Suppose the paleontologists became so committed to the new way of thinking that fossil studies were published only if they supported the theory and were discarded as failures if they showed an absence of evolutionary change. As we shall see, this is what happened. Darwinism apparently passed the fossil test, but only because it was not allowed to fail. Chapter 5, The Fact of Evolution. The point in dispute is not whether microevolution within species happens, but whether it tells us anything important about the processes responsible for creating birds, insects, and trees in the first place. Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, himself has written that even the first step towards macroevolution requires more than the accumulation of micromutations from natural selection. Chapter 6, The Vertebrate Sequence. Obviously, ancestors cannot confirm the theory if they were labeled as such, only because the theory told the researchers that ancestors had to be there. Another quote, "Amphibians to reptiles, no satisfactory candidates exist to document this transition." Of course, all this is as 1991. The molecular evidence. Quote, "Whatever its effect on other tissues, the molecular evidence does nothing to provide the hypothesis of creative natural selection with the empirical confirmation it so badly needs. Natural selection is a force for building adaptive complexity only when it is formulated as a tautology or as a logical deduction unconnected to empirically verifiable reality." Chapter 8, Pre-biological evolution. Even if one assumes that something much simpler than a bacterial cell might suffice to start Darwinist evolution on its way, a DNA or RNA macromolecule, for example, the possibility that such a complex entity could assemble by chance is still fantastically unlikely, even if billions of years had been available. Chapter 9, The Rules of Science. The more important priority is to maintain the naturalistic worldview and with it the prestige of science as the source of all-important knowledge. Without Darwinism, scientific naturalism would have no origin story. A retreat on a matter of this importance would be catastrophic for the Darwinian establishment. Darwinist religion. Darwinist evolution is an imaginative story about who we are and where we came from, which is to say, it is a creation myth. As such, it is an obvious starting point for speculation about how we ought to live and what we ought to value. Darwinist education. Whether a Darwinist takes an optimistic or pessimistic view, it is imperative that the public be taught to understand the world as scientific naturalists understand it. Science and pseudoscience. Chapter 12. The leaders of science see themselves locked in a desperate battle against religious fundamentalists. As the creation myth of scientific naturalism, Darwinism plays an ideological role in the war against fundamentalism. For that reason, the scientific organizations are devoted to protecting Darwinism rather than testing it, and the rules of scientific investigation have been shaped to help them succeed. I'm reading now from an epilogue written for the second edition, came out 2 years after the first. No doubt scientific naturalists regard the project of naturalistic explanation as overwhelmingly successful. Persons who do not share their a priori commitment to naturalism may nonetheless be correct in thinking that the reigning theory is not merely incomplete, but quite inconsistent with the evidence. These questions cannot be left to the sole determination of a class of experts, because important questions of religion, philosophy, and cultural power are at stake. Naturalistic evolution is not merely a scientific theory, it is the official creation story of modern culture. The scientific priesthood that has authority to interpret the official creation story gains immense cultural influence thereby, which it might lose if the story were called into question. The experts therefore have vested interest in protecting the story and in imposing rules of reasoning that make it invulnerable. End of quotes. By selecting inflammatory quotations, I have misrepresented Johnson's magisterial dissection of evolutionist claims as viewed from their documents. Besides his measured tone, his writing is notable for approaching the scientific theory of evolution of his day from every possible direction: scientific, logical, procedural, historical, social, and philosophical. By coming at it from all these angles, he suggests how today's thinking about evolution may be influencing us in all those same ways. Johnson does his homework. He ends his 156-page text with 43 pages of research notes. And he maintains due diligence while exposing weaknesses in the evolutionary theory of his day. He makes no arguments for Christianity specifically. Evolutionists today, to safeguard their claims from a less scrupulous enemy, could well weigh them against Johnson's arguments. I'm impressed. I find his contribution to clear thinking about evolution in its way as considerable as that of Woodger.